on vinyl community? Welcome to a special video with the record spinner. In today's video, I'm going to be talking about how I became a vinyl record collector, talk about how I went from being a casual record buyer to a full-on collector, and even shine a light on some of my earliest vinyl purchases that started my collection off and how it grew to become what is now my collection and what it's still growing to become. I figured I'll start off at the beginning, where it all should begin, and say that around the age of 3 or 4 years old, I saw a vinyl record for the first time. And it was such an intriguing object that caught my eye, and let alone the concept of taking out a record from a sleeve, putting it on a turntable, dropping the needle, and listening to music. It just seemed like such a far-out concept in my eyes when I was that young. Now, I had owned music on CD and cassette at the time when I was young. I even had a Play School tape player that I would play my tapes on. But I knew vinyl was something more special, something more unique, something, ritualistic when it came to listening to it. I just knew it was something special. My parents, when they were teenagers, and as they got older, they bought records, and that was their main way of listening to music, as well as cassettes and 8-tracks and other odd formats. But when CDs came out in the 80s, they went down that route, and they essentially bought on CD what they owned on vinyl. And they never looked back since. They still buy CDs to this day. But it wasn't a situation of they got rid of their albums. And I say this because at the time when I was a kid, we lived in a smaller house. And we had a storage unit where we would constantly just bring things out, take things in, just because we didn't have any room for most of this stuff. And I remember visiting there with my dad, and he would take out these crates and boxes full of records. And I would flip through them, and I would see albums by bands such as Rush, Yes, Genesis, Queen, Kansas. All of these bands that I would soon grow up to know and love and own in my personal collection to this day. And it was just so cool to see the artwork so big, open up the gatefold covers, see photos of the band, read the lyric sheets. All of these elements came together into what became this sort of mythological image of vinyl in my eyes when I was that young. And a little bit before that, before I saw, vinyl and what it was, when I was around 2 going into 3 years old, my favorite band, and still to this day, is Kiss. And I remember my dad owned on vinyl Alive, Destroyer, and Alive 2. And for me, as a big fan, he basically handed those down to me, saying, enjoy these, these are yours. So those were like the first albums that I received. They're probably somewhere in my house, all beaten up and, torn edges and the vinyl scratched up, because you give a kid a record, you're really rolling the dice. Of course, he showed me how to properly handle it and not to touch the surface, but when you're a kid, you didn't know better. And I also remember when I was around that age, my uncle had a vinyl copy of Rock and Roll Over, and I would always, nag him to play it because I really wanted to listen to it because I was such a huge fan. And I remember one Christmas, he gave me that record, and somewhere in my house is home movie footage of me unwrapping that record and seeing it and going completely, ballistic over it. Once I find it, I'll post it right to this channel. But it was just, such a cool thing to own. And with all that being said, those early, records that I received and the early ones that I bought them because it seemed like a novelty item. When I was that young, I had no clue that people were still collecting records and whatnot. I just thought, hey, CDs were it and that's it. I bought it for the novelty, side of it. So if I would go to a yard sale or a flea market with my dad and I saw an album that I liked that I had heard on CD, I would be like, hey, I want this. It's on vinyl. I want it. It's really cool. So if I had like 50 cents or a few bucks to blow, that's where my money went. And with that being said, it was just the whole novelty aspect, which also went into, the first new record that I purchased. When I was in the 3rd grade, one of the bands that I was really big into was the Ramones. And I was at a Hot Topic at a mall nearby, and I saw that they sold records, but they were new records. And that was when I clicked to myself and said, holy crap, they're still making, records to this day. Looking back now, they're reissues and represses, but I thought, holy crap, it's still being made. So I remember the first new record that I received was the Ramones' End of the Century. I don't have that record, unfortunately, to this day in my collection. Got scratched, and the cover was a bit beat up, and I ended up giving it away to someone in high school years down the road. But that was the first new record that I had owned. And then, flash forward some time later, I was in 6th grade in middle school, and one of the bands that I really liked at the time, the Kaiser Chiefs, had just released an album called Off With Their Heads. And I was at a record store with my dad, and I was going through the records that they had, and I saw the new album on vinyl, and I'm like, holy crap, I never thought I'd see this. I really got to get it. And I'm very glad that I took care of it to an extent to still have it in my collection and enjoy to this day. So in terms of like newly bought in vinyl, this is probably the oldest piece that I have in my collection. So while editing this video, I looked back into my record collection and I realized that there was a record that I did not mention at first. It just kind of passed my mind, so I figured I'd film this little segment, drop it where it would have been in the original video for the sake of covering everything. Around 2010, one of the bands that I was listening to at the time was Avenged Sevenfold, and at that year, they had just released their album, Nightmare, and around Christmas 2010, I was at a mall with my parents, and I went to a Hot Topic, and I saw that they had the album on vinyl, and I was like, oh, wow, that's really cool. And I guess my dad was probably with me, and turned out Christmas morning that year, snagged it, and I got it for Christmas, so this is it. And of course, this is an original press because it has been repressed since then. And the cool thing with this is that it's on a nice opaque red vinyl, and it is also numbered as well out of 2,000 copies. So with all of that, I would say this is probably one of the more valuable records in my collection. So I just wanted to mention that very quickly. Like I said, I didn't want to leave anything left out of this video, so I figured I'd put this right where it would have ended up in the original video. So anyways, enough of that, back to the original video. Flash forward about a year later or so, around 2009, 2010, I discover a band called the White Stripes. And I did my research on them and I became a huge fan of them, and Jack White for that matter. And I always linked them to vinyl because I knew that that was kind of the main format that they aimed for. There were a lot of 7 inches and of course the 12-inch releases of their albums. So when it came to them, I always linked them to vinyl, and I set out on getting every possible White Stripes vinyl release. So around 8th grade in 2011, I'm visiting a local record store, and I pick up this. This is their first single, Let's Shake Hands. And I remember freaking out because I'm looking on the backside and it says second pressing. And I'm thinking to myself, holy crap, this is a second pressing. I do my research sometime later, found out that the second pressing was done on black vinyl, whereas this came on red vinyl. So it is a counterfeit. But just, it was such a cool, object to own, and just a cool, record to have for the sake of being a White Stripes / Jack White fan. And then, about a year later after that, saw this at another record store. This is the Hotel Yorba single. And then around this time, I was hearing things about Record Store Day and all the fancy releases that they were doing. And this was what it was. This was a Record Store Day Black Friday release, which came on red vinyl. And I'm like, wow, another cool thing to own. Awesome. And then after that, I also picked up the White Stripes Handsprings and Red Death at 614 7-inch, as well as Jack White's solo single, 16 Saltines. So really at that point, I wasn't buying it for the novelty of it. I was buying it because I wanted Jack White and White Stripes related releases. And then around freshman year of high school, I discovered Pink Floyd. I didn't discover them. My parents were fans, but I dug deeper into Pink Floyd, and they became my second favorite band. And I was always, and still am to this day, I was always into the stuff that they did before Dark Side of the Moon. I mean, I love everything, but it's those early albums from 67 to 72 that I really love, especially the Syd Barrett stuff. I'm a diehard Syd Barrett fan. And I remember around spring of 2014, I got my first kind of legit job doing farm work for a family relative, and it was great money. And I went off and purchased with my own money the first record that I bought, like I said, with my own money. It is Pink Floyd's complete BBC sessions from 67 to 68. It is a bootleg. A local record store had this for a bit of a high price tag, but for the sake of having unreleased tracks such as Vegetable Man and Scream My Last Scream, this was kind of a must own. Very heavily bootlegged, these BBC sessions, and they would eventually be released officially under the Floyd banner in their early years box set, but it was just such a cool thing to own. And I remember opening it up. It's a 2 LP set. The first LP comes on black vinyl, but the second LP came on a sort of marbled purple vinyl with flecks of black, white, red, all kinds of colors, and it just looks really, really cool. And it's nice to have those early BBC sessions in one collection. So I bought that mainly for the sake of having those unreleased tracks, and also for the sake of being a huge Pink Floyd fan. And then my birthday rolls around in 2014, around September. And that was like the first birthday where I got, you know, the core of what my collection would grow to become. I mean, I was buying 7 inches mainly of the White Stripe stuff, but I really wanted to focus on LPs, which is why I don't collect 7 inches as much as I do with 12-inch vinyl. So for my birthday in 2014, I received the first White Stripes record, self-titled, their second album, Distill, their third album, White Blood Cells, and then to reference them again, I also received the Kaiser Chiefs' Education, 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 and War. And basically, ever since that birthday, I just went off on a total collecting spree, and I set out to get everything that I loved, whether it be from the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, present day, on vinyl, because I saw this as a hobby that I really wanted to pursue, and that is how I ended up being a vinyl record collector. How did you guys get started with collecting vinyl? Please leave a comment down below. I'd love to hear about it. If you enjoyed the video, please like it and subscribe to the channel. There's going to be all kinds of cool content coming your way, so I hope you guys enjoy it all. See you guys in the next video, and most importantly, keep the record spinning.